October 1944. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The transport truck lurched to a stop and Corporal Takeshi Yamada heard the metal gate creak open. He braced for what came next. Beatings, perhaps. Starvation. Maybe a bullet in the back of the head. He had surrendered on Saipan 3 months earlier, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, too weak to lift his rifle. His officers had told him what would happen. Americans were savages. Captivity meant torture. Death would be a mercy. But as the canvas flap of the truck pulled back and cold Midwestern air rushed in, Yamada saw something that made no sense. A line of wooden barracks stretching across a flat field. Guards with rifles, yes, but no bloodstains on the ground. No bodies hanging from posts. And then, as he was marched through the gate, he saw it. A sign painted in neat English letters, "Barber Shop." His knees nearly buckled. In that moment, he realized everything he had been taught about the enemy was a lie. Before we continue, if you're watching from Tokyo, Toronto, or Texas, hit that like button and let us know in the comments where you're joining from. It's incredible to think that right now, people from every corner of the globe are learning about these forgotten moments of history together. This channel exists because of you, and your support means everything. If you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Now, back to the camps where reality shattered propaganda. The Pacific War had produced prisoners slowly. Japanese soldiers were indoctrinated to die rather than surrender. The Bushido Code, drilled into every recruit, taught that captivity was the ultimate disgrace. Better to charge into machine gun fire or detonate a grenade against your own chest than to raise your hands. By 1944, however, the island-hopping campaign had created pockets of men too wounded, too starved, or too surrounded to resist. When they were captured, most believed they were already dead. The transition from battlefield to captivity was disorienting. Men who had fought in the jungles of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan were processed on beachheads, tagged with numbers, and loaded onto ships bound for the continental United States. The voyage across the Pacific took weeks. Below deck, they sat in silence, waiting for the execution they assumed would come. Instead, they were fed. Not well, but fed. Hardtack biscuits, canned vegetables, sometimes even rice. It made no sense. When the ships docked in San Francisco or Seattle, prisoners were marched off under armed guard and loaded onto trains. The landscape beyond the windows shocked them. Endless fields, towns untouched by war, factories belching smoke into the sky. Some prisoners had never seen such abundance. They had been told America was weak, decadent, on the verge of collapse. Yet here were cities lit by electricity, highways crowded with automobiles and railroads stretching to the horizon. The sheer scale of it was unnerving. These men had come from an empire that could barely feed its own troops in the field. Now they were riding through a country that seemed to produce everything without effort. The camps themselves defied expectation. High, barbed wire fences enclosed the perimeters, and guard towers loomed at each corner, but inside the layout resembled a military base more than a prison. Rows of wooden barracks stood in neat lines. There were mess halls, latrines, recreation yards, and administrative buildings. Some camps even had libraries stocked with English-language books and newspapers. For men who had spent months in foxholes crawling with insects, drinking rainwater from helmets, and eating nothing but stolen yams, the sight was incomprehensible. They had expected cages. Instead, they found order. The first shock came during intake processing. Prisoners were lined up and inspected by American medical officers. Doctors examined wounds, checked for diseases, and administered treatments. Malaria, dysentery, and infected cuts were documented and addressed. The Americans worked with clinical efficiency, issuing orders in curt English that interpreters translated into Japanese. Men who had been left to rot in their own units were now being injected with medicine and handed pills. It was not kindness. It was procedure. But to the prisoners, the distinction was meaningless. They were alive, and someone was ensuring they stayed that way. Then came the hygiene inspections. Guards handed out bars of soap, white and rectangular, stamped with military markings. Prisoners were ordered to shower. Communal facilities had been built with rows of showerheads connected to hot water systems. For soldiers who had not bathed in months, the sensation was overwhelming. Steam filled the air. Water, hot enough to sting, poured over bodies caked with dirt and sweat. Some men scrubbed until their skin turned red, unable to believe the luxury of it. Others stood frozen, convinced this was some elaborate prelude to execution. But the guards simply watched, enforcing compliance, ensuring every man washed. Shaving came next. Japanese soldiers had rarely been required to maintain clean-shaven faces during combat operations. Beards and stubble were common, even expected. But American regulations demanded otherwise. Safety razors were distributed, along with instructions on their use. Prisoners unfamiliar with the design fumbled with the blades, nicking their chins and cheeks. Guards demonstrated the technique, scraping foam and hair away in smooth strokes. The act felt humiliating at first. In Japanese culture, hair carried symbolic weight. To have it trimmed by enemy hands seemed like a final insult. Yet over time, the routine took hold. Smooth faces meant fewer lice, less itching, a strange sense of renewal. Uniforms replaced the tattered remnants of field gear. Prisoners were issued simple work clothes, denim or cotton garments marked with large white letters. POW. At first, this branding was degrading, a visual stamp of defeat, but the clothes were clean. They fit, and when they wore out or tore, they were replaced. For men who had worn the same rotting uniform for months, the contrast was staggering. In the Imperial Army, soldiers mended their own gear with whatever scraps they could scavenge. Here, the Americans maintained a supply chain that ensured every prisoner had functional clothing. It was efficiency weaponized. What unsettled the prisoners most was not the provision of these services, but the rationale behind them. American officers did not treat grooming as a courtesy. It was a rule, enforced with the same sternness as any military regulation. Cleanliness prevented disease. Order maintained discipline. Guards inspected barracks weekly, checking for lice, verifying that men had shaved, ensuring uniforms were clean. Violations brought reprimands. Compliance brought nothing, no reward, just the absence of punishment. Slowly, prisoners understood. This was not generosity. This was control. The barber shops inside the camps became one of the strangest symbols of captivity. Small buildings or sections of barracks were designated for haircuts. Chairs lined up in front of mirrors. Clippers hummed under electric current. Barbers, sometimes American personnel but often trained prisoners, worked in silence, trimming hair into regulation styles. The first visits were tense. Men sat stiffly, hands clenched, uncertain whether the scissors might be used as weapons. Instead, they received haircuts. Neat, uniform, efficient. For soldiers who had not seen their own reflections in months, the sight of their transformed faces was jarring. Clean-shaven, short-haired, almost unrecognizable. These barber shops served a dual purpose. On one level, they reinforced discipline. Orderly appearance suppressed individualism, making it easier to manage large groups. On another level, they showcased American adherence to the Geneva Convention. When Red Cross inspectors visited, they documented the facilities, photographed prisoners with neat haircuts, and filed reports confirming humane treatment. The barber shops became proof that the United States followed international law, even during a war where both sides had committed atrocities. For some prisoners, the barber shop became a place of unexpected normalcy. While waiting their turn, men whispered to one another, sharing rumors about the war's progress or observing the routines of camp life. A few even began to take pride in their appearance, competing quietly over whose haircut looked sharper. In diaries written years later, former prisoners described these moments as surreal. One account recalled sitting in the chair while the sound of a baseball game drifted in from outside, American guards playing catch in the yard. It was as if life in the camp followed rhythms entirely divorced from the war raging across the Pacific. Tailoring services added another layer of disbelief. In the Imperial Army, uniforms were issued once and expected to last until they disintegrated. Repairs were the soldier's responsibility, done crudely with whatever materials could be found. To discover that the Americans not only repaired but maintained prisoner garments seemed wasteful, even absurd. Yet many camps had tailoring sections staffed by skilled prisoners given tools, cloth, and thread. Torn shirts were collected, mended with precise stitches, and returned days later. Some prisoners turned the garments over in their hands, unable to comprehend why an enemy would invest time in sewing a captive's clothes. The tailoring system was systematic. Garments were logged, repaired on schedules, and redistributed in cycles that made camp life resemble a civilian institution. Officers who had once worn elaborate insignia now dressed in the same plain work clothes as enlisted men. The removal of rank distinctions struck at the heart of Japanese military hierarchy, where uniform symbolized honor and status. Americans, however, treated clothing as a matter of function, not pride. Prisoners assigned to tailoring duties worked with sewing machines powered by electricity, spools of thread in neat racks, and benches with proper lighting. For men with pre-war experience in textiles, captivity offered an ironic return to civilian trades. Some even found quiet satisfaction in the work, a chance to use skills that had nothing to do with war. Then came the laundry services, perhaps the most shocking revelation of all. In the jungles, Japanese soldiers had washed uniforms in rivers or not at all, letting sweat and mud accumulate until fabric rotted. To step into a camp where clothing was collected, washed, and returned on fixed schedules was beyond comprehension. Baskets marked with prisoner numbers were gathered, loaded onto trucks, and delivered to central facilities. Inside, steam-powered washing machines churned rhythmically, filling the air with the scent of soap. Prisoners unused to such machines stared in disbelief. The mechanical noise, the speed with which garments were cleaned in bulk, seemed almost magical. Clean bed linens added to the shock. Many prisoners had slept on damp ground or straw mats crawling with insects. Now, at regular intervals, sheets and blankets were collected, laundered, and returned smelling faintly of detergent. To lie on a bunk with crisp sheets was, for some, the first experience of such comfort since leaving Japan. One former prisoner later wrote that the sensation was so alien he found it difficult to sleep, unused to the absence of filth and vermin. Another described the moment he realized the sheets would be changed again the following week. It shattered everything he thought he knew about war. Behind these routines lay a calculated philosophy. American military doctrine emphasized that orderly treatment reduced rebellion. Healthy prisoners were easier to control than desperate ones. Cleanliness lowered disease rates, which in turn reduced the burden on medical staff and prevented epidemics. Guards enforced punctuality in laundry schedules, inspected cleanliness, and reprimanded those who violated hygiene rules. For prisoners, compliance became survival. Those who resisted faced isolation or punishment. Those who adapted found a strange mechanical form of dignity. The psychological impact was profound. Men who had marched into captivity with their self-image shattered, convinced they had dishonored their families and the emperor, began to experience something unexpected. The steady rhythm of cleanliness and grooming slowly rebuilt fragments of personal identity they thought forever lost. For the first time in months, they saw their faces in mirrors, wore clothes without holes, and slept in bedding that did not reek of decay. These small details struck at the core of how they perceived themselves as human beings rather than defeated soldiers. What the prisoners could not see was the propaganda value of their treatment. News of camp conditions traveled beyond the fences. Red Cross reports circulated internationally, documenting the provision of haircuts, mended clothing, and laundered linens. Photographs of clean, well-groomed prisoners countered enemy narratives of American cruelty. For a nation fighting a brutal war on two fronts, The image of humane captivity bolstered morale at home and undermined Axis propaganda abroad. Every neatly folded uniform and every prisoner sitting in a barber's chair became part of a global information campaign. The contrast to Japanese military culture could not have been sharper. The Imperial Army had emphasized stoicism. Suffering was noble. Comfort was weakness. Prisoners found themselves confronting a completely different philosophy. Discipline not through deprivation, but through regulated well-being. This realization unsettled their worldview. If their own army glorified endurance at the expense of health, why did the enemy, whom they considered decadent, achieve control through the opposite means? Some began to suspect that America's strength lay precisely in its ability to balance order with provision. There were also moments of quiet transformation. A prisoner who had been despondent might suddenly regain pride when handed freshly laundered clothes. Another might look at his reflection after a haircut and realize he appeared younger, almost like the man he had been before war. Such experiences did not erase the bitterness of defeat, but they chipped away at the despair of captivity. Later testimonies revealed that these small acts of cleanliness gave men the psychological endurance to survive years behind wire. Yet not all accepted these routines positively. Some officers believed that adapting to such comforts dulled the spirit, erasing the warrior mentality instilled by Japanese training. They warned their men not to become soft under the enemy's care. This tension between old values and new realities defined life in the camps. Still, the overwhelming effect was undeniable. Enforced hygiene reshaped behavior, instilled calm, and gave prisoners a way to navigate the strange limbo of captivity without collapsing into hopelessness. By late 1945, as news of Japan's surrender filtered into the camps through whispered translations and official announcements, many prisoners reflected on their captivity with confusion. They had expected humiliation. Instead, they had been maintained, not coddled, but kept functional, orderly, and alive. The months and years behind barbed wire had not matched the nightmare scenarios painted by their commanders. Some sat in their barracks at night, trying to reconcile the propaganda with their lived experience. They had been told Americans would work them to death in mines, starve them deliberately, torture them for sport. None of it had materialized. Instead, they had received haircuts on schedule, worn mended clothes, and slept on laundered sheets. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Some wrote letters home describing the barber shops, the tailors, the laundry machines. They struggled to find words that would not sound like lies or delusions. How could they explain to families in bombed-out cities that their captors had maintained washing facilities with hot water? How could they describe the electric clippers and sewing machines when their own relatives were scavenging for food in the ruins of Tokyo and Osaka? The letters were carefully worded, avoiding details that might be censored, but even the sanitized versions shocked recipients. Families in Japan struggled to believe the accounts. Mothers wept reading descriptions of their sons receiving medical care. Wives questioned whether the letters were genuine or elaborate forgeries meant to break morale. How could the enemy, portrayed for years as demons bent on extermination, have provided such care? How could the same nation that firebombed their cities have operated barbershops for prisoners? The answer lay not in kindness, but in systems. America had waged war with logistics as much as firepower, extending its industrial capacity even to the maintenance of enemy captives. The same organizational principles that had produced 300,000 aircraft and 88,000 tanks during the war years had been applied to prisoner management. Supply chains, standardized procedures, and bureaucratic efficiency governed everything from meal schedules to laundry rotations. It was not compassion that kept prisoners clean and healthy. It was the American belief that order prevented chaos, that system prevented breakdown. The camps ran like factories, and prisoners were processed like any other logistical challenge to be solved with resources and regulations. When the gates finally opened and prisoners boarded ships for repatriation, many carried small possessions issued by the camps. Clean uniforms, carefully folded, toiletries, bars of soap still wrapped in paper. In some cases, even photographs taken during captivity, black and white images showing men with neat haircuts standing in front of barracks, looking nothing like the skeletal, desperate figures they had imagined themselves to be. These items became relics of an experience that defied the narratives they had been taught. They packed them carefully, knowing these objects would be the only proof of what had happened, evidence of a captivity that felt increasingly unreal the closer the ships came to Japan. Veterans returning to Japan faced shame for having surrendered, a stigma that would follow many for the rest of their lives. In a society that had glorified death before dishonor, survival itself was seen as a moral failure. Some never spoke of their time in American camps, burying the memories under decades of silence. But privately, in conversations with other veterans or in journals kept hidden from families, many admitted that survival had been possible only because of the unexpected order within American camps. The barbers, tailors, and laundry services were not acts of mercy but tools of control, maintaining discipline among captured soldiers. Yet in a brutal war, such control felt like mercy. Decades later, veterans recalled barbers' chairs and folded sheets symbols of captivity's strangeness, where they expected death but instead found order and the shock of cleanliness.